Congratulations on your maker box for quilting. In this tutorial, we're going to show you how you can take all of the fabric and notions inside and turn it into this charming quilt. To get started, let's see what's in your box. In the box, you'll find a project book, Pellon fleece batting, several pieces of Kona solid fabric, a charm pack of 5.5-inch squares, an Olfa cutting mat, an Omni non-slip ruler, an Olfa rotary cutter, and then a zippered pouch with several things including thread, Class A needles, curved basting pins, and clover wonder clips. The project book includes several different quilting projects. For this tutorial, we're going to focus on the quilt on page 6, which is called Charm Pack Double Scramble Table Topper. So what we first need to do is to prepare all of our fabrics. Now we have our charm pack, which are already pre-cut for us, so we don't need to worry about that, but we do need to cut out 16 5-inch squares of the off-white, another 16 squares of our 7-inch in off-white, and then only 4 of the 7-inch squares in navy blue. And this is how we do that. This foldable mat is really easy to open and gives you a nice cutting surface. So we're going to go ahead and open that up, and then we're going to grab our first piece of fabric, which is going to be this off-white Kona fabric. And in the instructions, we said that we needed 16 5-inch squares. So I'm going to kind of open this fabric up, and using my rotary cutter and my ruler, I'm going to cut some strips of fabric. So if you're new to cutting fabric for quilting projects, one of the things you want to make sure is when you're folding your fabric is that you fold it with the selvages lined up together. So I've done that on my fabric, and then I folded it one more time so that it would lay nicely on my mat. And I'm just kind of smooth that out. What I like to do is to take my fabric and line it up, and I give myself a little bit over, and if you can see here, there's 0 on my mat, and I'm just going to cut a little bit off so that I know I've got a nice clean edge of my fabric. Okay, and then we mentioned earlier that we need a 5-inch strip, and we need several of those, and we also need a 7-inch strip. So I'm going to count over 5 inches, line up my ruler, and I'm going to cut a 5-inch strip. Okay, making sure that my ruler is lined up. So I've got a 5-inch strip, and you're going to cut 2 of the 5-inch strips. Okay, then I also need to cut a 7-inch strip, and I can either count 7 inches over, or I can shift my fabric down to 0 again, line it back up, and then cut right along the 7-inch mark. So I'm going to cut 3 of my 7-inch pieces, so don't forget that. And you also need to cut a 7-inch strip out of the navy fabric. And just remember that your navy fabric also includes enough for your binding and your backing. So let's take that 5-inch strip that we already cut, and again, you'd have multiples of this, and we're going to cut these down into 5-inch squares. So the first thing you'll want to do is to cut off that selvage edge, just so you get a nice clean edge. So I'm going to again line that up, kind of making sure that my strips are straight, and going to cut off that selvage. Okay, then I'm going to, I'm going to cut 5-inch blocks here, and I want you to notice that these are actually doubled, the strips are doubled. So I'm going to get 2 blocks each time I cut the 5 inches. So I'm going to again make sure my blocks are straight, and I'm going to line it up and cut, and then I have 2 5-inch blocks. And again, I can either move my fabric over or just move over with my ruler and cut on 10 inches. And then I can come over and cut at 15 inches. Again, lining my ruler up on both sides. And now I need to move my fabric over just a little bit, so I'll go back to 0. And then I'll cut 5 inches, and then I have one last piece left, so I can just keep this in my scrap fabric for a future quilt project. So same thing goes for the 7-inch, and again we have the white that we already cut as 7-inch, but I'm going to show it to you on the navy. So we're going to do the same thing. Again, we're cutting 2 pieces at a time. I would like to cut my selvages off. And on the navy, I only need 4 blocks total. So I'm going to, again, kind of line it up, make sure it's straight, and I'm going to cut 7 inches. So I can line it up with 14, and then again, cut, and then I've got my 4 7-inch blocks. So now that I've got my blue cut, I'm going to do the same thing with my 7-inch white strips, and we want to cut out 7-inch blocks. And again, you're going to have 3 7-inch strips that we're going to cut into 16 total 7-inch blocks. So again, I'm just coming over and cutting 7 inches, cutting another 7 inches. I'll set those aside. And then I'll kind of line my fabric back up. And I should be able to get one more set of 7-inch blocks out. And then again, I just have a little bit of fabric that I can add to my fabric stash for future quilts. So now that our fabric squares are cut, let's put our first block together. For the first block, select 5 prints from your 5-inch charm pack, and then select 4 white squares from the cut fabric. And we're going to arrange them like this into a 9-patch block. Using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, we'll sew our top 3 blocks together to make it into one row. We'll do the same thing for our center row and our last row. To create a 9-patch, we're going to sew all 3 rows together, again using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now that we have our first 9-patch together, follow the same process to complete 3 additional 9-patch blocks. For our next step, we're going to take the 9-patch and we're going to need to cut down the center to create 4 7-inch blocks. So I'm going to simply fold this in half and lining up my seams, and using my mat, I'm going to line that up and going to cut right down the center of my block. So now I have 2 halves. I'm going to again line these up, making sure my seams are lined up, using the grid on my mat, and cutting so that I have another 7-inch set of blocks. So now I have a total of 4 blocks, all 7 inches. You're going to do the same process for the remaining 3 9-patch blocks. So we'll take our 4 cut blocks, 1 of our 7-inch navy blocks, and then 4 of the 7 white blocks to create a larger square. Sew each row together and create a large 20-inch block. Repeat the same process so that you end up with 4 20-inch blocks. Now that my 20-inch blocks are all done, we're going to again cut these into 10-inch squares. So we're going to cut down the center going horizontally and vertically so that we end up with 16 10-inch blocks. So let's take one of our blocks and show you how we cut them into the 10-inch squares. So I'm going to take this 20-inch block, fold it in half, and just kind of give a light finger press in the center so that I know that I'm about halfway through the middle of the block, and then quarter your fabric, so fold it one more time, and then again just give yourself a light finger press. This will just be helpful when you're cutting with the mat since we have such a large block. And again line up my seams, and then I'm going to line this up with my grid, and using the ruler and the rotary cutter, I'm going to cut in so that I have a 10-inch. Or 10-inch cut that way, and then I'm going to open these pieces up, and again that finger press is going to help me to line up for my second cut. Again, using my ruler and my rotary cutter, and go ahead and cut that. So you're going to end up with 4 completed blocks that are 10 inches, and we're going to repeat the process for our 3 remaining large blocks. So now it's time to lay out our quilt block, and we're going to take the blocks that we just cut and arrange them per the instructions in our project book. And you may notice that there's 2 different quilt block patterns for the large blocks. There's one which has your large printed squares all meeting in the center. Then there's another one that takes a little twist on this block and has 2 of your printed squares going on the opposite corners. We're getting so close, our quilt top is almost all put together. What we're going to do next is we're going to take these rows of blocks and we're going to sew them together 1 row at a time. And then we're going to repeat the same thing with our other remaining 8 blocks so that we have 1 large quilt top. Now that our quilt top is all ready to go, we're going to layer this so that we can prepare it for quilting. So you're going to notice that I've got my quilt top, then I have a layer of the batting which also came in my maker box. And then I have the backing fabric, and I've cut that a little bit larger than my quilt top. Also included in the box were some of these curved safety pins that we're going to pin our fabric layers together, so our batting, our backing, and our quilt top all together, so that it holds it all in place when we take this to the machine to quilt. In your project books, you're going to find on page 32 some basic finishing techniques. So it talks about squaring up your quilt, preparing your backing, also information about ways and options to quilt, and how to prepare your binding for your quilt project. While there's a variety of options of ways you can quilt your project, we're going to stitch in the ditch. So to stitch in the ditch, we're going to use a straight stitch, and we're just going to follow the seam lines of our quilt to create our quilt design. Once you've finished quilting your entire quilt top, we're ready to prepare it for binding. Before we can attach our binding, we want to first remove any of the excess batting and backing fabric. So we're just going to simply trim that away. Once you've removed your excess batting and backing, we're ready to attach the binding. If you need additional help with how to attach binding, make sure to check out the helpful hints in your project book. So once you finish attaching your binding, you're going to press and fold your binding to the back of the quilt, and then you can either hand sew it in place or use your machine in a decorative stitch to attach the binding securely to the quilt. Congratulations, look what we made. What a super fun project. We can't wait to see your finished projects, so join the maker community and share your photos. Thanks for joining us.